There is new U.S. intelligence that is indicating Russian President Vladimir Putin could try to test NATO's unity with a limited attack on a NATO-allied country. The assessments warn that Russia could conduct a small-scale incursion or a cyber attack designed to test NATO's commitment to Article 5. Article 5 states that an attack on one member is an attack on all.
What you just heard described is a formal U.S. intelligence assessment, not a political warning, not a think tank projection, but a classified evaluative document produced by American intelligence agencies and shared with senior officials. The Wall Street Journal broke the story on August 7, 2026, citing 3 sources familiar with those assessments. CNN subsequently confirmed the reporting through its own sources. The core finding: Vladimir Putin could attempt a limited military action against a NATO member state, with the window for such action running from this autumn through the year 2029. That is a span of roughly 3 years, which sounds long. But the phrase "as early as this fall" narrows that window considerably. Intelligence assessments are never predictions. They are probability evaluations based on intercepts, behavioral analysis, and source reporting. What this assessment says is not that Putin will attack. It says he is planning for the option of attacking, and that under certain conditions, primarily if he cannot find a face-saving way to exit Ukraine, he may choose to exercise that option. The distinction between planning and intending matters enormously. Russia maintains military planning documents for scenarios it has no present intention of executing. What makes this assessment significant is not merely the existence of planning. It is the specific combination of factors that intelligence analysts believe could activate those plans. And those factors are all present right now.
It effectively lays out that there's a window of time where Vladimir Putin believes he could test and see how much he can get away with effectively as far as encroaching on NATO territory, challenging the member states to their commitment to Article 5 to defend an attack against one is an attack against all. And that is...
The intelligence assessment describes a menu of options rather than a single plan. And that menu is deliberately designed around one central goal: staying below the threshold that would force NATO to invoke Article 5. Article 5, NATO's collective defense clause, commits every member to treat an attack on one as an attack on all. It is the foundational promise that gives the alliance its deterrent value. But Article 5 has always had ambiguities. The most important is definitional. What counts as an armed attack? When Russia conducted sustained cyber attacks against Estonia in 2007, NATO did not invoke Article 5. When Russian missiles and drones crossed into Polish and Romanian airspace during the Ukraine conflict, NATO convened emergency meetings, but did not invoke Article 5. Putin and his military planners have studied these precedents carefully. The least likely scenario in the assessment is a small-scale conventional land incursion, a physical crossing of a NATO member's territory with Russian or Russian-directed military forces. That would be the clearest trigger for Article 5, and Western security sources believe Russia does not currently have the spare capacity for that kind of operation, while its forces remain committed in Ukraine. More probable are scenarios involving cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, power grids, communication systems, financial networks that cause serious harm without firing a single weapon, or sabotage operations conducted through proxies, deniable actors, or what military analysts call hybrid warfare. The deliberate blurring of the line between peace and conflict to create situations where Article 5's trigger is genuinely ambiguous. On August 5, 2026, just 2 days before this report was published, workers at Leipzig Airport in Germany discovered an armed drone planted on the tarmac near a Ukrainian cargo aircraft. The drone contained both an explosive detonator and an unidentified substance. A DHL cargo plane departing from the same airport sustained minor damage from an unidentified small object. These are not coincidences. They are consistent with a documented pattern of Russian hybrid operations against NATO infrastructure,
really predicated on this idea that U.S. officials and NATO officials believe that Putin is growing frustrated by taking serious losses in the war with Ukraine and could move to shift his tactic by focusing on NATO in particular. He does see potentially an opportunity here to expose some fractures within the alliance and could particularly target some of the smaller, less strong.
The focus on the Baltic states and Poland is not arbitrary. It reflects the specific geographic and strategic vulnerabilities that military planners on both sides of the NATO-Russia divide have been analyzing for years. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania share land borders with Russia and Belarus, both of which are aligned against NATO. They are the three smallest NATO members by population and military capacity. Estonia has a population of roughly 1.3 million. Latvia, 1.8 million. Lithuania, 2.8 million. All three gained independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, and all three entered NATO in 2004, specifically because of the security guarantee that membership provides. That guarantee is now what Putin is calculating against. There is also Kaliningrad, the Russian exclave on the Baltic Sea, sandwiched between Poland and Lithuania, separated from mainland Russia by the very countries it is surrounded by. Kaliningrad is heavily militarized. It hosts Russian nuclear-capable Iskander ballistic missiles. It is the only point from which Russia could launch a ground operation into NATO territory without crossing through Ukrainian, Belarusian, or other non-NATO territory first. Military planners for years have treated the so-called Suwalki Gap, the narrow land corridor connecting Poland to Lithuania between Belarus and Kaliningrad, as one of the most strategically sensitive points on the entire European continent. A Russian operation to sever the Suwalki Gap, even temporarily, would physically disconnect the Baltic states from the rest of NATO's land territory. It would not need to occupy territory permanently to create a crisis. It would only need to demonstrate that NATO cannot protect its own eastern flank. That demonstration, if successful, would be the most damaging blow to the alliance's credibility since its founding.
Member states in an effort to see how much action he can get away with before crossing that Article 5 threshold. And I'm told that this intelligence does suggest the most likely targets would be places like the Baltics or Poland, places where we've actually seen some recent Russian activity.
Drones and cyber attacks.
Exactly.
Right?
And over the last several years, we've seen a pretty steady pace of that kind of activity. But this intelligence lays out various scenarios in various ways Putin might want to test the alliance's strength.
The most important context for understanding why Putin might view this as an opportune moment is the state of the U.S. commitment to NATO under the current administration. President Trump has repeatedly and publicly questioned whether the United States would defend NATO members that do not meet defense spending targets. He has described NATO allies as failing to pay their fair share. He has, in various statements, left ambiguous whether the United States would invoke Article 5 for a country he views as delinquent on its obligations. That ambiguity is not noise. From Putin's perspective, it is signal. The entire deterrent value of Article 5 rests on the credibility of the American commitment. If that commitment appears conditional, the calculation for a limited provocation shifts. A cyber attack that disables Estonia's power grid for 3 days does not automatically produce an American military response. If the response is hesitant, political, or disputed within NATO itself, the operation achieves its strategic objective without firing a conventional weapon. This is why the intelligence assessment uses the phrase testing NATO's unity. The attack itself may be secondary to the response it provokes, or fails to provoke. Germany's Foreign Minister, Johann Wadfuhl, put it bluntly in a recent statement. Our intelligence services are telling us urgently that Russia is at least creating the option of a war against NATO by 2029. The German government convened an emergency meeting of its National Security Council. Poland has confirmed it is receiving systematic briefings from the United States about Russian plans for its eastern flank. The eastern members of NATO, those who share borders with Russia or Belarus, are not treating this as theoretical.
Now, the one sort of other alternative here is that if Putin is able to secure some sort of a face-saving agreement of some kind to end the war in Ukraine, there is potential there for him not to have motive for shifting his attention elsewhere. But again, the talks, the dialogue between Russia and Ukraine, intermediated by the United States, has stalled, we're told. So it's really up in the air here, and we are told senior officials are very concerned about this very real threat.
NATO's Article 5 is the most important sentence in the most important treaty in post-war European security. But as the intelligence assessment implicitly acknowledges, Article 5 has a structural weakness that has existed since it was drafted in 1949. It commits members to take such action as it deems necessary to assist an ally under attack, not to a specific military response, not to an automatic declaration of war. The language is deliberately flexible. That flexibility, which was useful during the Cold War, has become a potential vulnerability in the era of hybrid warfare. A cyber attack that shuts down a NATO member's hospital systems for a week, causing deaths, disrupting civilian life, demonstrating Russian capability, does not fit cleanly into the armed attack framework that Article 5 was designed for. NATO has formally stated that cyber attacks can, in principle, trigger Article 5. But the threshold has never been tested in practice. Putin's military planners know this. They have built entire operational concepts around the space between conventional deterrence and conventional conflict, what Russian military doctrine calls the gray zone. The Leipzig airport drone incident is one data point. The Romanian apartment building struck by Russian ordnance in May 2026 is another. These are not accidents. They are incremental tests of NATO's response threshold, conducted in ways that give Moscow plausible deniability and force Western governments to debate attribution before they can even begin to debate response. By the time consensus is reached in 30 NATO capitals, the strategic damage may already be done.
What's your reaction to this reporting?
I think it has to be taken seriously. The Russians have been playing around with incursions for the last couple of years. In last September, they used an armed incursion to go after Poland. In May, they used an armed drone to go after Romania. And just this last week,
Leon Panetta served as CIA Director from 2009 to 2011 and as Secretary of Defense until 2013. John Bolton served as National Security Advisor and as U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. Their analysis carries institutional weight, but it is worth grounding that analysis in what the intelligence community itself acknowledges about its own limitations. Estonia's Foreign Intelligence Service released its own assessment earlier in 2026, reaching a notably more cautious conclusion. Russia does not intend to launch a military attack against Estonia or another NATO country in the near term. The agency simultaneously warned that Russia is rebuilding military capacity and that Europe needs to strengthen its defenses. That combination, low near-term probability, rising medium-term capability, is precisely the distinction that intelligence assessments are often weakest at. Capability and intent are separate variables. Russia may have the technical ability to conduct operations against NATO territory while having no present decision to do so. Plans are not orders. Preparations are not commitments. The private security firm Recorded Future published its own threat assessment in February 2026, concluding that Russian military capabilities could create conditions for an incursion into NATO territory over a 3 to 5 year period, while also emphasizing that the probability of a proactive Russian military operation remained low. The U.S. government assessment goes somewhat further than Recorded Futures, but it doesn't go as far as the framing of an imminent attack. What it says is that the option exists, the conditions that might activate it are present, and the window is open. That is enough to take seriously. It may not be enough to panic. What it requires is exactly what NATO has been doing since 2022 and must now do more urgently. Build defensive capability on the eastern flank fast enough to make the option genuinely unattractive to exercise.
Does Putin look at the U.S. bogged down in Iran with this missile defense issue and see that this may be his moment to strike?
Well, I think he is watching the Trump administration in Iran very carefully, and what he smells is fear. The fear that Trump is in a situation where he doesn't have a ready solution to the problem of American gasoline prices at the pump for American consumers, And in the weeks and months before an election, that may well be a place where Putin could try to put pressure on another NATO country. But bear in mind, if Russia had the resources to really
pull back from the specific intelligence finding and look at the full picture, what August 7th, 2026 represents is not the beginning of a new threat. It is the public surfacing of a threat that Western intelligence agencies have been tracking for years. Estonia warned about it. Germany warned about it. Poland has been receiving systematic briefings about it. The Wall Street Journal's sources chose to allow this assessment to become public at this specific moment, and the timing is not accidental. It occurs as NATO member states are debating defense spending, as the United States administration continues to send mixed signals about its commitment to the alliance, as Russia's Ukraine campaign continues to grind on with no clear end, and as Russian hybrid operations against NATO infrastructure, from sabotaged airport equipment to drones striking EU territory, are accelerating. The U.S. intelligence community is not predicting an invasion. It is warning that the conditions under which Putin might choose to test NATO are present, and that the window begins now. The appropriate response to that warning is not panic. It is acceleration. Acceleration of defensive deployment on NATO's eastern flank. Acceleration of investment in cyber defense capabilities. Acceleration of the clarity and credibility of the American commitment to Article 5, which is ultimately the only thing that makes Putin's cost-benefit calculation come out against action. Sean Parnell, speaking for the American military, said, "We have everything required to strike at the time and place of the president's choosing." That is the right statement. The question that the intelligence assessment raises, quietly between the lines, is whether the president will choose to strike. That question does not have an intelligence answer. It has a political one. And right now, the political answer is less clear than at any point since NATO was founded. What would you do differently?